World Trade Organization, and Cecilia Malmström, former EU Commissioner for Trade and Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. These talks were recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel if you want to take a look at them after our event today. And today, as part of the series, we are pleased to host Everett Eisenstadt, Senior Partner at Squire Patton Boggs, who has held senior leadership roles in the U.S. Congress, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the White House, and a Fortune 50 company. Everett will be in conversation with Anthony Esteva-Ordal, who is a resident fellow at the Georgetown Americas Institute, where he leads the project Latin America in the Global Economy. He's also a senior research fellow at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, and he previously served at the Inter-American Development Bank. Finally, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to submit questions throughout the event. Tony and Everett will have a conversation for around 40 minutes and then open for Q&A. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Denise. And good morning, Everett. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Our conversation will be on some global trade issues, but as much as possible, we'll try to connect with some of the Latin American challenges and opportunities that these countries have in this new emerging environment. And I'd like to start, Everett, with the big picture. I think that most analysts would agree that the global trading system appears to entering a new area. Some people will say that it's an area of less liberalization, maybe less based on economic efficiency principles and more on geopolitics and economic security concerns. And I'd like to ask you, Everett, first to start your views on that. What's your views on the global trade governance today? What's the state of the play? Where we are and how we came here, how we arrived to this point. And maybe more specifically, I would like to ask if you think that we are witnessing a kind of a temporary adjustment to globalization, or rather the emergence of a fundamentally new trade order. Let's start with this global picture, and thanks again for joining us.
Well, first, Tony, thank you for the invitation. It's really great, and the work the Georgetown Americas Institute is critically important to understanding the dynamics. So I'm really proud to be able to contribute to the conversation and appreciate the opportunity. It's an easy question, so we'll start with the easy ones first. No, I think this is a really seminal point in global economic history. I think people will look back at this point and see these few years that we are witnessing in real time as a turning point toward a new global trading order. And there's many different reasons for that. We can talk about some of the roots, but fundamentally, I've written a little bit about this, the fact that, we had emerging economies that were operating under systems that weren't quite market-based and coming into the WTO and really putting pressure on the system, and kind of a dissatisfaction with the WTO's ability to manage all the complexity. This could, we could have an hour-long discussion about the WTO and, the World Trade Organization and where it needs to be amplified. But I think one of the fundamental problems was, number one, the rise of litigation within the WTO. The dispute settlement system worked really well. And so people governments would tend to take things to dispute settlement rather than negotiate amongst themselves for outcomes. And then second was the inability to really move forward on any cutting-edge issues. We saw how hard it was to get just the fish subsidies across the finish line. And I know that the economy today is facing a lot of problems. Fish subsidies is a serious problem, but there's a lot of other problems: steel subsidies, industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprise, market manipulation. So, and the WTO just can't deal with it because you can't get a consensus needed to get a negotiated outcome. And so the negotiating has really atrophied. And I think as a result of that, there's been kind of an abandonment of the WTO as a forum for world trade. And of course, the pandemic demonstrated that supply chains were more vulnerable than governments and even business had recognized. So the combination of the WTO's inability to deal with a lot of these issues, plus the recognition that trade was more than just-in-time efficiency integration has really moved us towards a new paradigm. And you asked whether this paradigm is short-term or long-term. I think it's long-term. I think we're at the beginning of a new dynamic.
Thank you, Everett. Maybe just to stay with the WTO for a minute before getting into other topics, and you just mentioned the issues that have been raised. I would say, I think you mentioned rightly, this goes back to early 2000s, or even back to 1999 with the Seattle Ministerial. Maybe that's a turning point for the WTO. And then, of course, more the structural issues that we have seen in the last 25 years. You mentioned China, and maybe more recently the COVID shock to the system and others. But maybe to stay just for a minute to the WTO, if you think the system is still worth keeping, and we know that there's going to be an important ministerial 5 months from now in March 2026, I think, in Cameroon. There's any opportunity there for reform? There's lots of talks about potential reform of the WTO. Do you see any 2-3 priorities that you would like to see if this system is worth keeping, and if any reform could be actually achieved, or at least a path to reform could be achieved in the next 5 months, moving into the next ministerial?
Well, it's a good question, and I think that yes, I think the WTO is absolutely worth preserving, and I think there will come a point in time, and we can talk. We're talking kind of big picture here. It's absolutely a forum that's necessary for dialogue, and it is a forum where I hope that the majority of governments will continue to abide by their commitments made to the WTO. That being said, it's not equipped to deal with all the issues that are manifesting themselves in the world today, in the global economy. But it is a very valuable incubator of ideas and a very valuable source for dialogue. And I'm fairly confident that a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing outside the WTO, the negotiations that are ongoing among subsets of countries, or some of the alliances that are being built on critical mineral supply chains and AI export. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of happening outside the WTO that eventually could be folded into agreements in the WTO. So if we didn't have it, we would create it. So I think it's very important to retain, and I think it will continue to have a very important role.
Yeah, quick follow up on this, Everett. One is on the role, and this is linking to our Latin American audience here, the role that some LAC countries can actually play a constructive role in this reform. There's any suggestions here for the region? As you know very well, Latin America has been very engaged since the very beginning with the WTO system. And the question would be if there's any constructive role that here can play in this particular moment in time. And then on your second point on the rise of plurilaterals, like maybe to expand a little on this, do you see them as emerging as part of the WTO system, or as maybe parallel ways of engaging what people call coalitions of the willing around some topics? There's actually a very recent, which I like to hear from your views on this, a very recent initiative called the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership. You probably have heard about that, the FITP. There are 3 countries from Latin America that are engaged in this initiative. Very similar to what happened in the TPP, when we have some small countries, middle power countries, putting the seeds for something larger. How do you see the LAC participation in these type of initiatives?
Well, I think they're all important, and we were part of the mindset around, as you talked about, the into the 2000s and where the WTO really started to lose resonance. I think that part of the effort from governments was to find alternative forums for trade integration and to bring those within the WTO. And of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was one, and as you rightly noted, Tony, that was built on, it started out with 4 governments, right? Uruguay, if I recall correctly, Singapore, I think Australia. I can't remember.
New Zealand, I think. Yep.
Yeah, New Zealand.
Brunei, yeah.
Yeah, and the idea, and then you saw what it expanded to, right? It was a massive, global, almost global initiative. Of course, it didn't come, when we withdrew, it didn't come to fruition for us, but it still exists in a different form. So I think these forums are important. These dialogues among like-minded countries are very important, and who knows where they'll lead. I mean, they can lead to a subset of countries joining the larger agreement, or even the larger agreement being folded into the WTO discipline. So I think that is really important. There are areas where I think there's a lot of common interest. I think, just look at what's happening with rare earths and China and new export controls on commodities. That's a new concept. We've had export controls on high value technology, on things that are being deemed national security, but now commodities are being deemed as a national security priority. Of course, the region Latin America region has enormous potential and contributes greatly on the natural resources, including some of these rare earths and critical minerals that are really almost a super important component of the technology being utilized today, and potentially the energy of the future with electric vehicles and electric power continues to grow.
Yeah.
So, that's a space where I think there can be a dialogue and should be a dialogue about what kind of disciplines should those be, what kind of trade disciplines do we need there? And if the WTO doesn't do it, or a subset of countries don't do it, then we're going to have individual countries doing it. And it's going to be a very, very patchwork and spotty environment. And look at what just happened when China put export controls on rare earths and basically said you need a license, and then says we're not going to give you a license, and all of a sudden they've got a chokehold. So yeah, there's a definite role to play, and definitely a need for that.
Yeah, I hope maybe we have some time, and then I'd like to go back to the issue of the critical minerals, and also the role that Latin America can play in this new environment, given what you just said, the endowments that they have. But let's move just now maybe from Geneva to Washington, where most of the trade policy realignment action is happening. And I'd like to ask a little bit about the current U.S. Tariff strategy. You have been an insider in many of these policy making here in Washington. It appears that this, the second President Trump administration is using this tariff for multiple objectives. Some people say that this is just a negotiating tool for securing some specific concessions from partners. There's also the objective of just raising revenue from tariffs, which is already happening, or as a little bit more complex, an industrial policy lever to
Right.
try to attract more, encourage domestic production, attract kind of reshoring investments into the United States and so on. Could you talk a little bit about the logic and maybe the hierarchy of these different objectives in the current U.S. Tariff policy? And also maybe the question for our Latin American audiences, how Latin America should read this mix of tariff strategies in the way that they would like to engage with the United States moving forward.
Yeah, very, very, kind of two different
Question.
approaches there. But I think, on you missed one of the purposes, and that's to fight unfair trade practices, right?
Yeah.
To eliminate the trade deficit. So really, I think one of the reasons that really likes tariffs is because it's almost a Swiss Army knife of international trade policy. It can do everything, right? It can raise revenues. It can fight bad foreign policy. It can be used for reshoring. It can be used for to raise revenue, as you say. And really, it's interchangeable, right? They can have multiple effects, so it's, but I do think that the president's been pretty transparent about this. He said, when he was campaigning, that he was going to use tariffs, and he said, I'm going to use tariffs for these purposes. And then he did, and he's used different statutes. Of course, the one that's, under review now at the Supreme Court is the IEEPA statute, International Emergencies Economic Powers Act. And that one has been used for a number of different regimes, fentanyl tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China, tariffs on India for selling oil to, or buying Russian oil, and of course the Brazil tariffs for a whole litany of issues, including, the judicial proceedings against the former President Bolsonaro. So, um, he's used all the statutes almost. There's still some that he hasn't used yet, but he's used them to try to meet these four purposes, and he's having some success. Right, he's raised a lot of revenue. He has definitely impacted foreign policy choices that governments have made. You've seen like in Canada where they decided not to move forward with a digital services tax because they were concerned with tariffs. He's used it for immigration purposes. We've seen that. He's the threat of tariffs against Colombia. It's working to some degree. And there hasn't been a lot of retaliation, which I was quite surprised by, because typically when a country imposes, breaks their tariff bindings and imposes higher tariffs, there's a retaliatory dynamic, but there hasn't been much of one. So it is really reshaping the whole global trading system and having some success. So when I think about where we are in the process, we are now at a point where the fundamentals of the president's agenda are in place. He's got the reshoring is happening to some degree. The foreign policies are still being pursued. We'll have to see what comes next on that front. But I think the basic planks are there, but there's some externalities that could disrupt that. And one of those is the Supreme Court case pending on the IEEPA tariffs that could have a significant impact. So, for the region, I think, we have the United States has more FTAs in Latin America than any other part of the world. And it was a huge plank for many presidents, bipartisan plank of our economic and foreign policy to engage countries in the region through trade. It's hard to remember, Tony, and you'll remember this but just to even contemplate, the free trade area of the Americas, and it was even under discussion to have such an entity, right? It was a completely different time. But the trade agreements are there, and now they're under pressure. We should probably at some point talk through, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and its implications for the region. There's now a 301 proceeding against Nicaragua review. A 301 statute is used to review unfair trading practices. There was one that was initiated under President Biden on Nicaragua's labor practices that's now been resurrected by the current administration just very recently, which would obviously impact the CAF to DR. And then we've got the Colombia situation. A lot of tension and problems in the region. I think the trade environment is very volatile right now in the region. But I also believe that the USMCA negotiations may be one of the templates that sets the stage for the rest of the world. So it's going to be, there's a lot to unpack there, but it's a very interesting dynamic.
Maybe we could talk a little bit, you just mentioned, and before getting a little bit more deeper into the current structure of existing US FTAs and how this could evolve into the future in different formats. Maybe just a little bit on the USMCA, which you just mentioned, because that could definitely be a potential template for other existing FTAs. For those who don't know, who are listening, the USMCA has to have a review in 2026. Maybe you can just comment a little bit on this process. But maybe more important, I think that there's two questions here, Everett, that I would like you to address. One is, how do you see the North American, compact bloc surviving this USMCA review? There's of course lots of kind of forces that can maybe break this down into potential bilateral deals between the three partners. How you see these dynamics between preserving the North American bloc vis-a-vis a much more bilateral approach to, even for some specific sectors, maybe just, the auto sector is and you know this very well. It's a particularly very different strategy vis-a-vis Canada and vis-a-vis Mexico from the point of the United States. So that's one question. And the second is the one I think you are also referring, is the potential updates that we may see in this review. Updates in areas like rules of origin, maybe in labor issues, maybe in investment issues. If you could, even though I think this is a little bit of too early to tell, where you see this potential kind of new disciplines evolving. I'm particularly interested on the origin issue, that we could see, a drastic change from kind of all approaches to origin, just determining which good is a Canadian good, is North American good, to origin criteria applied to other issues like investment issues and even technology sourcing and so on. So you could just unpack a little bit how the USMCA could have these externality effects.
Well, sure. Those are, yeah. So I'm happy to do that. And I think just to kind of give some foundational background for folks who may not be familiar, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was a renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, where the rules of origin were tightened and changed, and they added labor and environment disciplines as well. It was highly supported by the U.S. Congress. I think it got the highest votes that I can recall. I don't know if it was the highest of any trade agreement, but it was a pretty well supported initiative. But President Trump was actually the one who renegotiated that. So the idea that it's maybe renegotiated again is interesting for sure. One of the things that in the renegotiation process that they put into place was this automatic review. And this review comes up, as you noted, in July 2026. It's mandated, and it could be a very simple review. The way it works is that the three governments can come together and say, yes, we think the agreement's fine, let's continue it. That doesn't look like that's going to happen, at the least. But so if they don't come to a consensus about the three governments continuing, what happens? It rolls over year to year until it finally terminates, I think, after 10 years. So it could be in a state of just kind of uncertainty for a long time that could have significant effects on investment. If nothing else happens, if there's no other conversation, if the only thing they do is just go through the review process, it still could be pretty dramatic for investment in the region. But we know they're going to do things because they've said as much. And even the former administration had said, oh, we're going to have a renegotiation of this agreement. So President Trump has said that as well. And one of the dynamics that we've seen that you pointed to, Toby, is that there's a real probability, and I would even go beyond a possibility, a probability that this agreement becomes split into two separate agreements, a U.S.-Canada agreement and a U.S.-Mexico agreement. Not a certainty. That's certainly the trend lines that are happening now. So that's something that's definitely under contemplation, I know, here in the United States. And I think that the negotiations with Canada and Mexico are in very different places. Mexico, I think they're much deeper, much broader. With Canada, they seem to be still trying to feel each other out at the negotiating table, like not really engaging as deeply as with Mexico. So that's just to kind of level set where we are. So, to answer your question, yes, this could definitely turn into bilateral agreements. And they can be very differentiated agreements. You could have a situation where with Mexico, it becomes a much, much deeper, broader agreement with new areas. Mentioning the updates, it could go into things like, we've seen some of this in some of the recent agreements in Asia with Cambodia and Malaysia, where there's now language on uniformity on export controls and investment. Foreign investment. And this is all about China. It's all about China. And so that's kind of a new area for a trade agreement, is to have a common dialogue about what kind of export controls on what products. In addition to that, there's a real interest in content. What is actually a product of the region? And there's a lot of concern in the United States and that globally that China is going around the tariffs that have been put in place and investing in other countries to try to move product that's actually Chinese through those countries and using free trade agreements to do that. That gets into the rules of origin question. Will there now be a modification to the rules of origin for utilization of a trade agreement that includes, ideas like a foreign entity ownership, can only have a certain percentage of foreign entity ownership. Outside of, say, Mexico, you could only have 25% of the foreign entity owner. So those are going to be really, really tough problems. And in addition to that, there's a lot of discussion about heightened labor standards and things like that. I think that, when you put all that together, you're looking at an agreement that's going to be more like a framework around a group of countries and an integration. And it's going to be quite interesting. It's very important. I think a lot of the reasons that the amount of trade between Mexico and the United States is massive, Canada as well. So we're talking about a huge percentage of trade that has not been subject to the tariffs to date. What happens in the USMCA will have pretty significant impacts on those trade flows. So it's going to be a long slog, and it's going to be quite transformational, I think.
Eric, you mentioned very interestingly these recent agreements that the U.S. has signed with Malaysia and Cambodia. I think these the ones that you mentioned in the context of ASEAN, which of course is a different approach to the traditional FTAs. Some people could call it kind of more modular approach. It's definitely a different structure than the traditional agreements. But you just said before that in the case of Latin America, many countries in the region have already these existing, frameworks that have been signed in the past, 20 years. Not with all of them, as you know, mostly with Andean countries, Central America, and so on. There's, of course, some missing pieces there, Argentina, Brazil, the biggest ones. How do you see this preserving this architecture or, kind of reach? The architecture, as I understand, is not the same as the USMCA that can be reviewed. This is an architecture that has there's some enforcement rules already in place. Do you see some potential changes down the road? What would be the approach for the ones who have FTAs and the ones who do not have FTAs with the United States?
I think the answer is yes. There's definitely going to be change. The question is, how will that form? What form will that change take? And the modification of an existing agreement, or will it be a framework on top of an agreement? Right. So look at the U.S.-Korea situation. There's a model where the U.S. and Korea have a trade agreement. We've had one for many times. Many years, right? It's approved. It's got rules and disciplines. It didn't have a joint review in it, but and now we're negotiating different trade standards on top of that, right? So, and that includes things like investments in the United States and some other commitments. That's where you have one coming in on top of an FTA. I think the USMCA is going to be an actual recalibration of an existing agreement. I don't know whether it's going to have to go back through Congress or not. That is a big question. Is how much can you move and change an agreement without going back to Congress for approval? My feeling, and I think those would agree, that if it doesn't change U.S. law, it does not have to be approved by Congress. So we'll see how far they can go. I think for some of these others, it's going to be episodic. There may be some countries that want to enter into a more trade agreement and may seek to do that. But in general, it's probably going to look more like the Korea dynamic. New disciplines being placed on top of an existing agreement, a framework on top of the FTA. One interesting dynamic that is an opportunity for a lot of governments in the region and businesses as well, is that unlike in prior administrations where it was, some of the fundamental trading principles were, number one, you had to meet certain standards that have a free trade agreement with the United States. You had to do certain things before you could even begin that conversation. Generally, that would start out with something like a trade and investment framework agreement, and then you'd build up from that. And then, of course, the agreement had to cover everything. It's everything's agreed to, nothing's agreed to until everything's agreed to. That was the big mantra. Well, that's not the case anymore. This is a much more transactional. So you don't have to have a holistic agreement. We could have a trade agreement with Argentina. It doesn't look anything like CAFTA-DR or Colombia or USMCA. It's more like a framework agreement like we have with Cambodia or Malaysia. So it's really both, that's an opportunity. And I'm a big believer that a lot of these frameworks and changes that are happening in the international trading system are eventually going to be rolled over, and Congress will have a role. At some point, Congress will get involved. They have the tariff authority in the United States. they will need to be involved. The institutions that are currently are not structured to deal with the kind of changes we have now. We can talk about that. So there will be some trade legislation coming down the pike, and that's where those framework agreements say if we did one with Argentina, it could become something more formalized. So as we started, as we noted at the very outset of this conversation, we were in a period of transformation. It's happening in real time. That's why it's so confusing, because we don't have a foundational perspective, right? We only have what we knew, which was a very different trading system built on different objectives and negotiated with different rules. These rules are changing every day, and it makes it very hard to to do business today, but also to predict exactly what it's going to look like, in 5 to 10 years from now.
A footnote on this question, just a small footnote here, Everett, because I remember, I think you were involved personally in the CAFTA negotiations, right?
Yeah.
Would this approach that you just outlined would apply also regionally in groups like CAFTA, or you see this more also bilateral approaches too early to tell?
I mean, I'll say it could eventually, but I don't really think that the administration likes to do things that way. It doesn't like the idea of like 6 countries against the United States. So, and also the CAFTA DR region, and candidly, we have governments in very, very different places, and they will the CAFTA DR went into place. Nicaragua is not anywhere in the same place where the Dominican Republic is, or El Salvador, or Guatemala. They're very different places. So I think if anything, we'll see something more along the lines of what's happening in USMCA, where you have the potentially more bilateral dynamics that are superseding the regional dynamics. Whether that's good or bad, I mean, I personally thought, CAFTA DR could have been a great, and can still be, and potentially will be, a great integrator for the region, for Central America. But, at this point in time, the political environment is not.
It's a different environment. Yeah. Everett, let's go back to one topic that you mentioned early on, just to get a little bit kind of deeper on that, which is the importance of critical minerals, rare minerals that you in every single kind of industry that we can think of, and the type of deals that the different countries are trying to do, is the Europeans, the Chinese, the US, and so on. Of course, Latin America plays an important role because it has an important endowments of this particular resource, which is increasingly important. And I have 2 questions for you here. One is how you see the potential competition between China and the United States in this region. This has been going on for a while. Now there's the dynamics are a little bit different. Any thoughts and insights on how Latin America should play this potential competition in very, very important resource?
One of the, going back to an earlier theme, one of the effects of the WTO losing its preeminence is that you now have a lot of countries that are subject to just national pressure, right? and economic pressure. And of course, China's a huge market for many countries. They purchase a lot of commodities, they purchase a lot of agriculture goods, they invest a lot. And in the United States as well. So, you've got a lot of these economies that are going to be caught between 2 big powers, right? And they're going to have to manage that. And there's a real tension and conflict between, the trade dynamics between the United States and China. And so regionally, countries can be caught up in that. But it is so I wouldn't say it's like the Cold War in that sense, but in some sense it is a battlefield, for commodities and natural resources. And right now China has the upper hand. They've got the supply chains, they've invested, they control a lot of the minerals and the processing, and really have the upper hand on it. And that was it's been recognized, I think, when they came out with that export controls on some of these. So part of what I think the administration is doing now is, with this 1-year pause on some of these initiatives with China, the Trump administration is buying time to establish new and alternative supply chains. There's a massive amount of government support being allocated towards developing and processing and acquiring supply chains and critical minerals. So for the region, I think this is a great opportunity to really look to engage with the U.S. and U.S. companies to develop these supply chains, because the political support is there, the money is there, and we know that the resources are there in the region, and we don't have them here in the United States. So, or a lot of them we don't. So that, I think, is a key dynamic that's going to be part of the regional conversation for a long time to come.
Everett, I think you mentioned at the beginning when you just gave kind of the big picture on the global trade architecture. You mentioned COVID as one of the initial shocks to the system, when we realized that the supply chains had a lot of vulnerabilities, and we had to start talking with different policy tools to prevent this from happening again. That was a kind of a very particular short-term shock. But there had been these kind of more structural changes in the last, few years. One, the geopolitics, security issues that we just mentioned, the case of critical minerals and so on. But the other disruption, the other structural shift that you also referred to at the very beginning, which is the disruptive technologies. That's kind of the other kind of big underlying shift that we have to deal in the trading system. So I'd like to ask a little bit to talk a little bit about how these new technologies are kind of changing the environment, the trade environment, the opportunities that these changes have for Latin America. And in particular, maybe one particular question is this idea of potential fragmentation of the regulatory frameworks to regulate digitalization issues, artificial intelligence. We know that this is a complex issue. And I want to just maybe just give have your insights on how this is kind of evolving, and what are the opportunities for regions like Latin America that have some important potential resources, skills in this field.
Yeah, I think the fragmentation is inevitable, and it's really going to be disruptive on both existing technologies and new technology.
And the new ones.
And it is, at the end of the day, and going back to the original theme, like, well, what happens post WTO? We're probably going to end up with a trading system that's going to be a hybrid, where you still have a lot of interdependence on commodities, agriculture, trade occurring, low value products, not low value per se, but low, not the high tech, heavily IP oriented technology. I think in that space, you're going to see a big bifurcation between China and the United States. It's going to happen over time with increasing divergence in standards, and that's going to put the region in a very difficult spot. So, at some point, governments are going to have to make choices, and are you going to adopt this technology or that technology? And that's really going to evolve, and that's going to be one of the key determiners of a country's where they land, right? If they adopt a bunch of Chinese technology, they're probably going to have a lot more Chinese investment, with the pros and cons of that. I think there's more cons than pros. If you adopt the U.S. technology, there'll be more of that. And then, of course, there's the indigenous technology as well. And so, if I were in the region and I'm a tech entrepreneur, I would be thinking about how can I leverage this opportunity that's being created by government interest in advancing technology? How can I partner, and who should I partner with to advance that technology? And there's a lot of interest in that. So it's going to be very difficult. It's not going to be based on efficiencies or cost efficiencies by any means. It's going to be more about national security. Yeah.
One particular area in this field, which I think you know quite well, Everett, I'd like to know your views on that, especially because the region is highly dependent on SMEs and especially the booming of services, which the region has a real potential, is the potential restrictions on e-commerce, what's happening in the case of the US changing the thresholds, the discussions of the WTO on the moratorium for e-commerce. How do you see this field? This is a particular area of importance for many countries in the region that rely a lot on this type of business opportunities. How do you see evolving the way we'll regulate e-commerce moving forward?
Well, I think, Tony, there's going to be more, just as there's more scrutiny on, the manufactured imports. I think there's going to be more scrutiny on data exchange and where is the data going? Who has it? How is it being used? Where is it stored? And as you recall, the United States was one of the leaders in keeping data flows uninhibited. I think those days are diminishing, candidly. So yeah, I think it's going to be a real challenge. Data, AI and data and what goes in is going to be one of the big cutting edge issues. It's going to be dominating conversations for a long time. I mean, I don't want to be a naysayer by any means, but there's a real danger that a lot of economies that are not large economies that aren't writing the rules for the global trading system will find that the diminishment of the WTO is very detrimental to their interests, and that they kind of get lost a little bit and left out.
Yeah.
And I think that's really unfortunate because it's going to hurt productivity, it's going to hurt economic growth, and that's just the trend line we're at. I mean, governments, are at the point where they're willing, and even the president says this sometimes. It's like, look, we don't need to have a consumer-oriented society. What he's trying to do is really to move the United States away from a consumer-oriented society to a manufacturing society again. And that's not going to have that kind of a transformation in an economy as large as the United States is not going to be easily done. It's going to have a lot of disruption. So it is a really volatile environment. And there's a couple other points. I know we're getting close to time. There's a couple other things that I think we should not ignore. One, the immigration policies are having a significant impact on the region. Those aren't going to change, both for, I say they're not going to change. They could change, but I do think that the ability to come into the United States can be very difficult for a long time. That'll have impacts on reparations, which are very, not reparations, sending money back to home countries. I think that's it. I'm not sure I've got the right word for that, but so that's going to have an impact. And then, of course, even the idea of like having a large visa fee on skilled workers in the United States, that's going to have an impact. So immigration is something we can't discount. It's going to have economic influence. The militarization of the Caribbean right now is a very volatile dynamic, and so that could really put the region have a significant impact for depending on how that goes. But there's a lot of military assets down there. It's all part of an effort to battle counter narcotics and drug trafficking, which is a huge priority for the president. He's making it a priority with Mexico. It's something that he feels like in Venezuela that there's a lot of drug trafficking going on, and so this could be helpful, in many parts of Latin America where drug trafficking and criminal organizations have become very powerful. So this is something we got to keep our eye on because we have a very significant impact. And then, of course, foreign aid. Is it's curtailed, and that's going to have an impact as well. So there's just a lot of things happening. I think the trade stuff is huge, but these other trends are something we shouldn't ignore either because they all influence the region in different ways.
I appreciate, Everett, that I think you ending with this note because I think we tend to see when we are just talking about trade that this is just an issue about the architecture around trade. I think there's lots of issues about global governance architectures that are being challenged, and you mentioned development cooperation, I think it's one area. Of course, migration, it's another area. But if you move into financial issues and so on, so this is a really kind of a larger restructuring of the way that, the rules we had in the last, 50 years almost are being challenged in many, many domains. So trade, I think, is just only one. And, when we talk about reforming the WTO, reforming the trade architecture, I don't think this is an independent question from reforming other things of the international economic architecture. So that's, I think, we should keep in mind. I think this broader perspective that you just did. We just kind of end with the 45 minutes more or less that we had allocated to this conversation. I don't see any particular questions, and maybe I'll ask Denise or Kate to confirm that we don't have any questions on the.
There's nothing in the Q&A.
There's nothing on the Q&A. So yeah, and nothing on I don't see anything on the chat also. So maybe if we don't have anyone that wants to take advantage of having Everett here, I will ask maybe just a last kind of question, waiting if there's anything else to finish this conversation, Everett. And maybe the question would be, if you have, tomorrow to travel down to any middle-sized country that you know well in the region, and you have to talk to the trade minister or even the president, and you have to advise him on what to do, not the kind of long-term policies that I think you described very well that are needed, but something a little bit more short-term, things that, you would recommend to do, like the 1, 2, 3 priorities that one should be kind of focusing on in the next 2, 3 years to navigate this trade war. There's not only with partners like the United States, but with other global partners. What type of recommendations you will advise to some high official in the region if you had to travel tomorrow?
Well, I mean, it would be country specific, but I do think one, be present in the conversation, and you can't just assume that your voice is going to be heard government to government. You've got to get the business community engaged.
Private sector, yeah.
And one of the things that's in the United States is very true, is that it's a very matrix government. Yes, the president is very powerful, but you need to be talking to a lot of people over a long period of time, and they need to know who you are and your government and your how your relationship with the United States. So number one is be present. Number two is look for ways to align your interests with the current geopolitical environment that's transpiring, right? Don't try to play the game that was played 15 years ago. It's just a new game.
Okay.
And when you kind of shift out of that paradigm and try to see things from the other government's perspective, I think you'll find common areas of interest. I mean, look at Argentina, right? Who would have thought that we would have expanded beef imports from Argentina, right? Tony, really, right? It's incredible. So those are there. So that's one of them. And also, just making sure that you're also have your own opportunities domestically on education and job creation and training programs for citizens, because at the end of the day, that is the most important resource any government has, is its citizens, and they need to be well educated and trained. And we have the same problem in the United States.
Sure.
So strong education system is the core of anything. So even then, aligning, with other universities and programs can help in that space as well. So I mean, obviously there's more than that, but that would be some of the things I would think.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good. I have one question. Maybe we'll take this one before we close. So it's a very specific question. It's maybe something close to your heart when you were negotiating with some of these countries, especially in Central America. The question is, what's your opinion regarding the perspectives within the current trade climate for the textile industry, which is very relevant for many Central American countries? This is a very specific question for a traditional manufacturing industry, which is very, very relevant still for some economies.
Absolutely, and I've visited many of those factories, and it's really, really important employment. I think that it's under stress for sure. In some ways, there may be more opportunity, and I think one of the dynamics that's evolving is because there's differentiated tariff regimes. You don't have to have zero tariffs; you just have to have lower tariffs. So, why are some of these governments entering into framework agreements? Because it enables them to lock in a known tariff rate and say, hey, okay, we're going to have a 10% tariff, and so if your competitor's got a 20%, you have a 10%. I think that the textile industries can still take advantage of those margins and export to the U.S. market. I do believe that the 301 on Nicaragua is a very serious investigation, and one that could result in that market being impacted by additional trade barriers. So that's part of it. But yeah, I don't really see the textile industry is not going to move back to the United States. But the current structure where the textile industry was one of the leading edges of our international trade efficiencies, I don't think that's going to happen anymore. And it's going to put stress on margins and probably knock out some of it, to be candid. Yeah.
Everett, this has been a fascinating conversation. I don't see any other question. I think we almost exhausted our time. I really appreciate your time for being here with us today. And I'm sure we'll have other opportunities in the near future to keep kind of looking at this evolving landscape, very challenging times. And I learned a lot. I hope that our audience has also learned a lot. And thanks again for being with us this morning, Everett. Thank you very much.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Tony, and I appreciate everything you're doing in the Institute as well. So we will look forward to staying engaged and appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much.